Sarah Martinez never imagined that her grandfather's old hunting scope would become both her greatest source of humiliation and her path to vindication. As she stood at the edge of the Marine Corps shooting range at Camp Pendleton, clutching the weathered rifle with its ancient optics, the snickers and whispers from her fellow Marines felt like physical blows. The scope was a relic from the 1960s, its brass fittings tarnished green and its glass clouded with decades of use. Her grandfather, Miguel Martinez, had used it during his own military service and later for hunting deer in the mountains of Colorado. When Sarah enlisted in the Marines at 18, he pressed it into her hands with trembling fingers, his eyes wet with pride and memory. "This scope has never let me down, mija," he had said in his weathered voice. "It may not look like much, but it sees true. Sometimes the old ways are the best ways." Sarah had treasured the gift, not for its monetary value, which was practically nothing, but for what it represented. Her grandfather had been her hero growing up, the man who taught her to shoot tin cans off fence posts behind his ranch house, who showed her how to breathe steady and squeeze the trigger slow. He was the reason she joined the Marines, following in his footsteps of service and dedication. But now, surrounded by Marines with their state-of-the-art equipment and $1,000 scopes, Sarah felt like she was carrying a museum piece into battle. The other shooters had advanced optics with digital displays, rangefinders, and wind compensation systems. Their rifles gleamed with modern accessories and tactical modifications. Next to them, Sarah's setup looked like something from a history book. "Hey, Martinez!" called out Corporal Jake Stevens, a cocky marksman from Texas who never missed an opportunity to show off his custom rifle setup. "Did you find that scope in a garage sale? Maybe we should call the Smithsonian. They might want it for their antique collection." The laughter that rippled through the group of Marines was like salt in an open wound. Sarah kept her face neutral, her military training helping her maintain composure, but inside she burned with embarrassment. She had worked twice as hard as anyone else to get here, to earn her place in the advanced marksmanship program. Growing up as the daughter of immigrants in a tough neighborhood in Los Angeles, she had learned early that she would have to prove herself over and over again. Her father, Carlos, worked double shifts at a construction company to support the family. Her mother, Rosa, cleaned office buildings at night while studying for her citizenship test during the day. They had sacrificed everything to give Sarah opportunities they never had. When she announced her intention to join the Marines, her mother had cried for 3 days straight, terrified of losing her only daughter to war. But she also understood Sarah's drive to serve, to be part of something bigger than herself. The mockery continued as the Marines set up their shooting positions. Sergeant Williams, the range instructor, was a grizzled veteran who had seen it all in his 20-year career. He noticed the tension building around Sarah but said nothing, his weathered face giving away no emotion. Williams had learned long ago that the range was where true skill revealed itself, regardless of equipment or reputation. "All right, Marines!" Williams barked, his voice cutting through the chatter. "Today we're working on long-range precision shooting. Targets are set at 800 yards. This isn't about your fancy equipment or your daddy's money. This is about fundamentals, discipline, and heart. Every shot counts, and every shot tells me who you really are." Sarah felt her heart racing as she settled into her prone position. The concrete shooting platform was hard against her body, but she welcomed the discomfort. It reminded her of the countless hours she had spent on her grandfather's ranch, learning to shoot from uncomfortable positions, learning that comfort was a luxury a true marksman couldn't afford. As she adjusted her old scope, Sarah could hear the whispers continuing around her. Some of the other Marines were placing informal bets on how badly she would perform. The pressure was immense, but it was a familiar feeling. She had faced doubt and discrimination her entire life, from teachers who assumed she wouldn't go to college because of her zip code, to recruiters who questioned whether a small Latina woman could handle the physical demands of military service. The first round of shooting began with each Marine firing 5 shots at paper targets 800 yards away. Sarah watched as the others took their turns, their expensive equipment helping them achieve respectable groupings. When her turn came, she could feel every eye on the range focused on her and her antique scope. She settled behind her rifle, her cheek pressed against the familiar stock that her grandfather had worn smooth with decades of use. Through the old scope, the target looked different than it had through the modern optics she had trained with before. The glass wasn't as clear, the crosshairs weren't as sharp, But there was something honest about the view, something that reminded her of learning to shoot as a child. Her first shot rang out across the range, and Sarah felt the familiar recoil against her shoulder. She worked the bolt smoothly, chambering another round, her movements fluid and practiced. 4 more shots followed in quick succession, each one feeling right, feeling true. When the targets were pulled in for scoring, Sarah's heart sank. Her grouping was respectable but not exceptional, certainly not enough to silence her critics. The other Marines resumed their mockery with renewed energy, and Sarah felt the weight of disappointment settling on her shoulders like a heavy pack. But Sergeant Williams studied her target longer than the others, his experienced eye seeing something that the younger Marines missed. The shots were grouped tightly, showing consistency and control. More importantly, they were all slightly to the left of center, suggesting that Sarah's scope needed adjustment, rather than indicating poor shooting technique. After the range session ended, Williams approached Sarah as she was cleaning her rifle. The other Marines had already headed to the mess hall, their conversation filled with jokes about ancient equipment and wishful thinking. "Martinez," Williams said quietly, "that scope of yours is throwing shots left. Have you had it zeroed recently?" Sarah looked up from her cleaning, surprised that the sergeant was taking time to help her. "No, Sergeant. It's been years since anyone worked on it. My grandfather always said it shot true, but maybe things have shifted over time." Williams nodded, his gruff expression softening slightly. "Equipment changes over the years, Marine. Metal expands and contracts. Screws loosen, things shift. Doesn't mean the scope is junk, just means it needs attention. Bring it by the armory tomorrow morning. I know a guy who specializes in vintage optics." That evening, Sarah sat in her bunk, turning the old scope over in her hands. The brass fittings caught the light from the overhead fluorescence, and she could see her grandfather's fingerprints still etched in the metal from decades of use. She thought about his words, about seeing true, about the old ways being the best ways. Her bunkmate, Private Lisa Chen, sat down beside her. Chen was one of the few Marines who hadn't joined in the mockery, and Sarah appreciated her quiet support. "Don't let them get to you," Chen said softly. "I've seen you shoot. You've got natural talent. Equipment is just equipment. It's the person behind the rifle that matters." Sarah nodded, but the doubt gnawed at her. She had trained her whole life for this opportunity, but she was starting to wonder if her grandfather's gift was more burden than blessing. The advanced marksmanship program was competitive, and only the top performers would move on to the next level. She couldn't afford to fall behind because of outdated equipment. The next morning, Sarah reported to the armory as instructed. The man Williams had mentioned turned out to be Master Sergeant Rodriguez, a soft-spoken technician who had been working on military optics for over 15 years. He examined Sarah's scope with the careful attention of a jeweler studying a precious stone. "This is beautiful work," he said, his voice filled with genuine appreciation. "German glass, probably late 1950s or early 1960s. They don't make them like this anymore. The clarity is actually superior to a lot of modern scopes. It's just been neglected." Over the next hour, Rodriguez carefully disassembled the scope, cleaning each component with precision tools and specialized solutions. He adjusted the internal mechanisms, checked the alignment, and replaced several worn seals. When he was finished, the old scope looked transformed, its brass fittings polished, and its glass crystal clear. "Try this now," Rodriguez said, handing the scope back to Sarah. "I've zeroed it as best I can in here, but you'll need to fine-tune it on the range. This scope has a lot of life left in it. It just needed someone who understood its value." Sarah felt a surge of hope as she held the rejuvenated scope. Maybe her grandfather's gift wasn't the handicap she had feared. Maybe there was still a chance to prove herself, to honor both his memory and her own dreams. The following day brought another range session, and Sarah approached it with renewed determination. The other Marines were still skeptical, still ready with their jokes and dismissive comments. But Sarah no longer cared about their opinions. She had work to do. As she settled into her shooting position, Sarah felt different. The scope felt solid in her hands, and when she looked through it, the target seemed to leap into sharp focus. The crosshairs were crisp and clear, and she could see details that had been blurry before. Her first shot at 800 yards was perfect, punching through the center of the target with authority. The second shot followed, then the third, each one finding its mark with mechanical precision. By the time she fired her fifth and final round, Sarah had achieved something that made even Sergeant Williams take notice. A grouping so tight that all 5 shots could be covered by a quarter. The range fell silent as the targets were scored. Sarah's performance wasn't just good, it was exceptional. The kind of shooting that separated true marksmen from weekend enthusiasts. The Marines who had been mocking her equipment were suddenly quiet, their expensive scopes forgotten in the face of undeniable skill. But Sarah knew this was only the beginning. One good day at the Grange wouldn't silence her critics permanently, or guarantee her place in the program. She would need to prove herself again and again, to show that her grandfather's old scope wasn't a liability, but a tool in the hands of someone who understood its value. As she packed up her equipment that day, Sarah felt her grandfather's presence as strongly as if he were standing beside her. His words echoed in her mind. Sometimes the old ways are the best ways. She was beginning to understand what he meant, and she was ready to show the world that wisdom and skill mattered more than the newest technology. The real test was still to come. But Sarah Martinez was no longer the uncertain Marine who had been mocked for her grandfather's gift. She was a marksman who had found her confidence, and she was ready to take on whatever challenges lay ahead. Word of Sarah's exceptional shooting spread quickly through Camp Pendleton. Within a week, Marines from other units were stopping by the range to catch a glimpse of the woman with the vintage scope who had shot a quarter-sized group at 800 yards. The attention was both thrilling and terrifying for Sarah, who had spent her military career trying to blend in rather than stand out. Sergeant Williams called Sarah into his office 3 days after her breakthrough performance. The small room was cramped with filing cabinets and military manuals, the walls decorated with decades of marksmanship certificates and photographs of elite shooting teams. Williams gestured for Sarah to sit in the worn chair across from his desk. "Martinez, I've been thinking about your shooting," Williams began, his tone more serious than usual. "That grouping you shot wasn't luck. I've seen thousands of Marines come through this program, and what you did takes years to develop. Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Sarah straightened in her chair, suddenly feeling like she was under interrogation. "My grandfather taught me, Sergeant. We spent summers at his ranch in Colorado, shooting every day. He was very particular about fundamentals." Williams nodded slowly, studying a file on his desk. "I've been looking at your records. You qualified expert in basic training, but your scores weren't exceptional. Something changed between then and now. What was it?" The question made Sarah reflect on the journey that had brought her to this moment. Basic training had been a whirlwind of stress and adaptation, where she focused more on surviving than excelling. She had shot well enough to qualify as expert, but she hadn't pushed herself to see what she was truly capable of achieving. "I think I was trying too hard to fit in," Sarah answered honestly. "I didn't want to draw attention to myself. My grandfather always said that the best shooters are invisible until they need to be seen. Maybe I took that too far." Williams leaned back in his chair, a slight smile crossing his weathered features. "Well, you're visible now, Marine. The question is what you're going to do with that attention. There's a regional marksmanship competition coming up in 6 weeks. Teams from across the western United States will be competing, including some of the best military and civilian shooters in the country." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. She had heard about the regional competition, but never imagined she might be selected to participate. The competition was legendary among Marines, a proving ground where careers were made and legends were born. "I want you on the team," Williams continued. "But I'll be honest with you. It won't be easy. The other team members have years of competitive experience and equipment worth more than most people's cars. You'll be shooting against people who have dedicated their entire careers to precision marksmanship." The weight of the opportunity settled on Sarah's shoulders like a heavy rucksack. This was her chance to prove that she belonged among the elite, to show that skill and determination could overcome any disadvantage. But it was also a risk. Failure at this level would be public and devastating. "What would I need to do to prepare?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. Williams pulled out a training schedule that looked like a military campaign plan. 6 weeks of intensive training. Long-range shooting every day, physical conditioning, mental preparation, equipment optimization. "It'll be the hardest 6 weeks of your life, but if you're willing to commit, I believe you can compete with anyone." Sarah took the schedule and studied it carefully. The training regimen was brutal. 12-hour days that started before dawn and ended well after sunset. She would be shooting at distances she had never attempted, learning advanced techniques that most Marines never encountered, pushing her body and mind to their absolute limits. "I'll do it," she said without hesitation. "Whatever it takes." Williams nodded approvingly. "Good. Report to the advanced range tomorrow at 0500 hours. And Martinez, bring that scope of yours. We're going to push it to its limits and see what it can really do." The next morning marked the beginning of Sarah's transformation from competent marksman to elite competitor. The advanced range was unlike anything she had experienced before, with targets set at distances ranging from 600 to 1,200 yards. The shooting positions were challenging: steep angles, unstable platforms, and time constraints that would test every aspect of her skill. Her first day was humbling. While her grandfather's scope performed admirably, Sarah struggled with the advanced techniques and extreme distances. Her shots were consistent but not exceptional, and she could see the doubt in the eyes of her training partners. They were all seasoned competitors with years of experience, and Sarah felt like a novice pretending to belong in their ranks. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, the optics specialist who had restored her scope, became an unexpected ally during those early days. He would arrive at the Grange each morning with tools and adjustments, fine-tuning the old scope to perform at levels its original designers never imagined. "Your grandfather's scope has one advantage over all these modern optics," Rodriguez explained as he made minute adjustments to the windage. "It was built when glass was glass and metal was metal. These old scopes are like vintage cars. They last forever if you treat them right." But equipment was only part of the equation. Sarah's real challenge was mastering the mental aspects of competitive shooting. Under the guidance of Gunnery Sergeant Patricia Hayes, a former Olympic competitor, Sarah learned to control her breathing, manage her heart rate, and maintain focus under pressure. "Shooting at this level is 90% mental," Hayes explained during one of their sessions. "Your body knows how to shoot. We just need to teach your mind to get out of the way." The psychological training was as intense as the physical preparation. Sarah learned visualization techniques, meditation practices, and stress management strategies. She studied ballistics charts until she could recite wind drift calculations in her sleep. She practiced calling her shots, predicting where each bullet would hit based on how the rifle felt when she pulled the trigger. 3 weeks into the training, Sarah hit her first major breakthrough. She was shooting at 1,000 yards in challenging wind conditions when everything suddenly clicked. Her breathing synchronized with the natural rhythm of the rifle. Her sight picture became crystal clear, and she fired a string of shots that grouped within 2 inches at extreme range. The other team members stopped what they were doing to watch as Sarah continued her string. Shot after shot found the target with machine-like precision, each bullet cutting through the swirling wind as if guided by invisible hands. When she finally set down her rifle, the range was completely silent. "Holy shit," whispered Staff Sergeant Mike Torres, a veteran competitor who had been skeptical of Sarah's inclusion on the team. "I've never seen anyone shoot like that with vintage equipment." But Sarah's breakthrough brought new challenges. Word of her exceptional shooting spread beyond Camp Pendleton, reaching the ears of competitors from other military branches and civilian shooting organizations. Some viewed her as an inspiration, a reminder that skill mattered more than equipment. Others saw her as a threat to be eliminated. The psychological pressure intensified as the competition drew near. Sarah found herself the subject of intense scrutiny, with shooting enthusiasts debating her chances on online forums and military publications writing articles about the Marine with the antique scope. The attention was overwhelming for someone who had spent her life trying to avoid the spotlight. Her family became caught up in the excitement as well. Her grandfather, now in his 80s and fighting cancer, followed every development with fierce pride. In Abu Everty and Separated, this is the book. It's about history. Terre is confronted with the weight of their expectations and the weight of their savages' professors' practices within the ministers of the desolation and proclaimed to separate the ways of the search of experiences. During the final week of preparation, Sarah faced her darkest moment. A series of poor shooting sessions combined with equipment problems and mounting pressure sent her into a spiral of self-doubt. She began questioning whether she belonged on the team, whether her early success had been a fluke, whether she was setting herself up for public humiliation. Sergeant Williams found her sitting alone on the range one evening after a particularly disappointing training session. The sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the empty firing line. Sarah was holding her grandfather's scope, turning it over in her hands like a talisman. "Having second thoughts?" Williams asked, settling down beside her on the concrete shooting platform. Sarah nodded, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. "What if I'm not good enough? What if I embarrass the team, embarrass the Corps? Everyone expects so much now." Williams was quiet for a long moment, watching the last light fade from the sky. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-earned experience. "Martinez, do you know why I put you on this team? It wasn't because of that one good day at the Grange. It was because I saw something in you that you don't even see in yourself. You've got the heart of a true competitor, the kind of person who gets stronger when the pressure builds." He pointed to the scope in her hands. "Your grandfather carried that through Vietnam, through situations where missing meant his friends died. He trusted it with his life and the lives of his fellow soldiers. That scope has been tested in ways these modern competitors can't imagine." Sarah felt something shift inside her as Williams spoke. The scope wasn't just a piece of equipment. It was a connection to a legacy of service and sacrifice. Her grandfather had faced real pressure, life and death situations where performance meant everything. She was just shooting at paper targets. "The competition starts in 3 days," Williams continued. "You can spend that time worrying about what other people expect. Or you can remember why you're here. You're not representing just yourself. You're representing every Marine who's ever been told they're not good enough. Every person who's ever been underestimated because of their equipment or their background." That night, Sarah called her grandfather. His voice was weaker than she remembered, but his spirit was unchanged. "Mija," he said softly, "I want to tell you something about that scope. The day I carried it into battle for the first time, I was terrified. I was 19 years old, 10,000 miles from home, and I thought I was going to die. But when I looked through that scope, I felt connected to something bigger than my fear." He paused. His breathing labored. "That scope has never let me down, and it won't let you down either. But more importantly, you won't let yourself down. You have the heart of a warrior, Sarah. Trust it." The call ended with Sarah feeling renewed and focused. The competition would be the ultimate test of everything she had learned, everything she had trained for. But she was no longer the uncertain Marine who had been mocked for her grandfather's gift. She was a competitor, ready to prove that sometimes the old ways truly were the best ways. As she prepared for the biggest challenge of her military career, Sarah Martinez carried with her the wisdom of her grandfather, the support of her family, and the unshakable belief that skill and determination could overcome any obstacle. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change her life forever. The regional marksmanship competition was held at the sprawling Quantico Marine Base in Virginia, where autumn painted the landscape in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. Sarah arrived with the Camp Pendleton team 3 days before the competition began, her grandfather's scope carefully secured in a custom case that Master Sergeant Rodriguez had crafted from military-grade aluminum and foam padding. The competition facility was unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. Multiple ranges stretched across hundreds of acres, with target systems that could accommodate shooting distances from 300 to 1,500 yards. Electronic scoring systems provided instant feedback, and climate-controlled equipment rooms housed millions of dollars worth of precision rifles and optics. The facility represented the pinnacle of competitive shooting infrastructure. Teams from across the western United States had gathered for the event, representing various military branches, law enforcement agencies, and elite civilian shooting organizations. The roster read like a who's who of American marksmanship: Olympic medalists, world champions, and legendary military snipers who had earned their reputations in combat zones around the globe. Sarah's team was assigned quarters in a dormitory-style building that housed Marine competitors. As she unpacked her gear, she could hear conversations from neighboring rooms discussing ballistic coefficients, scope adjustments, and strategies for different shooting stages. The level of technical knowledge and experience was intimidating, making Sarah feel like a novice among experts. The opening ceremonies took place in a massive auditorium filled with competitors, coaches, and spectators. General Patricia Morrison, the base commander, delivered a speech about the traditions of American marksmanship and the role of precision shooting in national defense. As she spoke, Sarah noticed photographers and journalists documenting the event, their cameras capturing images that would appear in military publications and shooting magazines. During the equipment inspection phase, Sarah felt the weight of scrutiny as officials examined her rifle and scope. Other competitors had brought arsenals of custom equipment, rifles that cost more than most people's annual salaries, scopes with more computing power than early spacecraft, and ammunition loaded to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The inspection officer, a retired Marine colonel with 30 years of competitive shooting experience, spent extra time examining Sarah's scope. His weathered hands turned the vintage optic carefully, and his experienced eyes studied every detail. "This is quite unusual," he said, his voice neutral but curious. "When was this manufactured?" "Early 1960s, sir," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "It belonged to my grandfather." The colonel nodded slowly, making notes on his clipboard. "Well, it meets all the specifications for the competition. Sometimes the old equipment is the most reliable." He handed the scope back to Sarah with something that might have been a smile. "Good luck, Marine." The first day of competition consisted of known distance shooting at ranges from 600 to 1,000 yards. Competitors would fire from multiple positions: prone, sitting, standing, and improvised field positions. Sarah's squadron was assigned to begin at the 800-yard line, the same distance where she had first achieved her breakthrough grouping at Camp Pendleton. As Sarah settled into her prone position for the first string of fire, she felt the familiar weight of her grandfather's scope against her cheek. The target appeared clear and sharp through the vintage glass, and she could feel the steady rhythm of her heartbeat synchronizing with her breathing. Around her, other competitors were making final adjustments to their high-tech equipment, consulting digital devices and ballistic calculators. The range commands echoed across the firing line. "Shooters to the line, lock and load. Ready on the right, ready on the left. Ready on the firing line. Commence firing." Sarah's first shot broke clean and true, the recoil familiar and comfortable against her shoulder. She worked the bolt smoothly, chambering another round, her movements fluid and practiced. Through the scope, she could see her bullet hole appearing in the target's scoring rings, and she felt a surge of confidence. The intensive training at Camp Pendleton had prepared her for this moment. Shot after shot, Sarah maintained her focus and rhythm. While other competitors struggled with equipment malfunctions and environmental factors, her grandfather's scope performed with mechanical precision. The old glass seemed to cut through mirage and atmospheric distortion, providing a clear view of targets that appeared fuzzy through some modern optics. When the first day's scores were posted, Sarah found herself in the top 10 overall, a remarkable achievement for a first-time competitor. Her consistency across different shooting positions and distances had impressed even the most experienced observers. Several veteran competitors approached her during the evening meal, offering congratulations and asking about her shooting background. But Sarah knew the real challenges lay ahead. The second day would feature unknown distance shooting, where competitors would be required to estimate ranges and make ballistic calculations without electronic assistance. This was where experience and intuition would separate the elite from the merely skilled. The unknown distance range was set up to simulate real-world shooting scenarios. Targets were placed at various ranges from 400 to 1,200 yards, camouflaged among natural terrain features and partially concealed behind vegetation. Competitors would have limited time to identify targets, estimate distances, and engage with precision fire. Sarah's grandfather had spent countless hours teaching her to judge distances using natural references. The apparent size of objects, atmospheric effects on visibility, and the relationship between target characteristics and range. These old-school techniques were considered outdated by many modern shooters who relied on laser rangefinders and ballistic computers. The shooting stage began with competitors moving through a course that simulated a reconnaissance mission. Each shooter would encounter targets in sequence, with scoring based on both accuracy and time. Electronic timing devices tracked every movement, and penalty points were assessed for missed shots and excessive time expenditure. As Sarah approached her first target engagement, she quickly applied the lessons her grandfather had taught her. The target appeared to be a silhouette partially concealed behind a fallen log. Using the apparent height of surrounding vegetation as a reference, she estimated the distance at approximately 650 yards. Wind flags indicated a moderate crosswind from the left, requiring a compensation that she calculated instinctively. Her shot rang out across the valley, and the target immediately indicated a hit in the scoring zone. Sarah moved quickly to the next position, her confidence building with each successful engagement. While other competitors struggled with range estimation and wind calls, her grandfather's teachings provided an intuitive understanding that electronics couldn't replicate. The final target of the sequence was the most challenging, a long-range shot, at an estimated 1,100 yards across a valley where thermal currents created complex wind patterns. Most competitors took several minutes to set up their equipment and calculate the ballistic solution. Sarah took a different approach, relying on the techniques her grandfather had taught her for reading environmental conditions. She watched the grass patterns in the valley, noting how vegetation moved at different elevations. The wind was switching direction in a predictable pattern, creating opportunities for precise shots during brief lulls. When the moment felt right, Sarah settled behind her rifle and fired. The shot seemed to hang in the air for an eternity before the distant target indicated a perfect center hit. Around her, other competitors and range officials watched in amazement as the young Marine with the vintage scope delivered precision fire that would challenge the most advanced equipment. When the second day's scores were compiled, Sarah had moved into third place overall. The shooting community was buzzing with excitement about the Marine who was competing with equipment older than most participants. Photography crews followed her movements, and television reporters requested interviews about her unique approach to competitive shooting. But Sarah's greatest challenge was still ahead. The final day of competition would feature the most demanding test of all, team competition, where groups of 4 shooters would engage multiple targets simultaneously while under extreme time pressure. Communication, coordination, and absolute precision would be required to achieve winning scores. Sarah's team consisted of Staff Sergeant Torres, who had initially doubted her abilities, Sergeant First Class Jennifer Walsh, a veteran competitor with Olympic aspirations, and Corporal David Kim, a rising star in military marksmanship circles. The team dynamics had evolved throughout the competition, as Sarah's performance earned the respect of her teammates. The team event was structured as a tactical scenario where the 4-person squad would engage hostile forces at various ranges while protecting friendly personnel. Targets would appear and disappear according to a complex timeline, and successful completion required each team member to perform flawlessly while supporting their teammates. As the team prepared for their final run, Sergeant Williams pulled Sarah aside for a quiet conversation. His weathered face showed the stress of 3 days of intense competition, but his eyes reflected confidence in his protégé. "Martinez, this is what we trained for," he said quietly. "Everything comes down to the next 15 minutes. I want you to forget about the cameras, forget about the other competitors, forget about everything except what your grandfather taught you. Trust your instincts and let your training take over." Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of the moment settling around her like a familiar uniform. Through all the pressure and publicity, she had never lost sight of why she was here: to honor her grandfather's memory and prove that skill and determination could overcome any disadvantage. As her team moved to the starting position, Sarah caught sight of a familiar figure in the spectator area. Her grandfather, despite his illness and weakness, had somehow managed to travel across the country to witness her performance. Their eyes met across the distance, and she saw in his weathered face the same pride and confidence he had shown when teaching her to shoot tin cans behind his ranch house. The final stage was about to begin, and Sarah Martinez was ready to discover what her grandfather's scope could truly accomplish when pushed to its absolute limits. The 17-year record that had stood unchallenged was about to face its greatest test from the most unlikely of competitors. A young Marine who believed that sometimes the old ways were indeed the best ways. The final team event began at 0800 hours on a crisp October morning. Fog clung to the valley floor, creating challenging visibility conditions that would test every aspect of marksmanship skill. Sarah's team moved into position as the 4th and final squad to attempt the course, which meant they knew exactly what score they needed to achieve victory. The record they were chasing had been set 17 years earlier by a legendary Marine Corps team that included 2 Olympic medalists and a Medal of Honor recipient. Their combined score of 487 out of 500 possible points had never been seriously challenged. despite advances in equipment and training techniques that had revolutionized competitive shooting. As Sarah settled into her assigned sector of fire, she performed the mental checklist her grandfather had taught her decades earlier. Wind flags indicated variable conditions, with thermal currents creating unpredictable shifts every few minutes. Range cards showed targets positioned from 300 to 1,400 yards, each requiring different ballistic solutions and shooting techniques. Through her vintage scope, Sarah could see her assigned targets with crystal clarity. The old glass seemed to cut through the morning haze with supernatural precision, revealing details that were invisible to the naked eye. Master Sergeant Rodriguez's restoration work had transformed the 1960s optic into an instrument that could compete with equipment costing 20 times more. The team leader, Staff Sergeant Torres, coordinated final preparations through their communication headsets. Remember, we've got 15 minutes to engage all targets in sequence. Communication is key. Call your hits, call your misses, and support each other. Martinez, your sector includes the long-range targets. Trust your equipment and trust your training. Sarah felt her heart rate settling into the controlled rhythm she had practiced for 6 weeks. Her breathing synchronized with the natural sway of her rifle, and she could feel the familiar weight of her grandfather's scope against her cheek. Everything else, the cameras, the spectators, the pressure, faded into background noise. The starting signal echoed across the range, and Sarah's team began their assault on the 17-year record. Targets appeared according to a predetermined sequence, each one requiring immediate identification, range estimation, and precision fire. The tempo was relentless, demanding split-second decisions and flawless execution. Sarah's first target appeared at approximately 850 yards, a silhouette partially concealed behind natural vegetation. Using techniques learned from her grandfather, she quickly estimated wind speed and direction from the movement of grass and leaves at various elevations. Her shot broke clean and true, striking the target in the high-scoring center ring. Target after target fell to Sarah's precision fire. Her vintage scope, dismissed by many as obsolete, proved its worth with mechanical consistency that modern electronics couldn't match. While other competitors struggled with battery failures and software glitches, Sarah's grandfather's gift performed with the reliability that had earned the trust of combat soldiers decades earlier. The most challenging engagement came at the 12-minute mark when Sarah faced her longest shot of the competition, a target positioned at 1,350 yards across the valley where thermal currents created complex wind patterns. The atmospheric conditions were constantly changing, making ballistic calculations extremely difficult. Sarah applied every lesson her grandfather had taught her about reading environmental conditions. She watched the mirage patterns dancing above the target area, noting how the distortion indicated wind direction and velocity at different elevations. The vegetation in the valley told a story of air currents that sophisticated instruments couldn't interpret. When the moment felt perfect, Sarah steadied her crosshairs and fired. The bullet seemed to arc through space in slow motion, fighting against gravity and wind as it traveled toward the distant target. Time stretched like elastic until the target finally indicated a perfect center hit, a shot that would be talked about for years to come. With 2 minutes remaining, Sarah's team was performing flawlessly. Every target had been engaged successfully, and their accumulated score was approaching the record-breaking threshold. But the final sequence would be the most demanding, requiring all 4 team members to engage simultaneous targets while maintaining perfect coordination. The last challenge involved multiple pop-up targets that would appear for only 10 seconds each. Team members had to coordinate their fire to avoid interference while achieving maximum scoring potential. Communication and timing were critical. Any hesitation or confusion could cost them the record. Sarah's final target appeared at 1,100 yards just as the morning fog began to lift. Through her grandfather's scope, she could see the target clearly despite atmospheric distortion that made it appear fuzzy through modern optics. The old glass had been designed for combat conditions, where reliability mattered more than technical specifications. Her final shot rang out across the valley with authority, striking the target dead center just as it began to disappear. Around her, her teammates completed their engagements with equal precision, their months of training culminating in a performance that would redefine what was possible in competitive marksmanship. When the ceasefire command echoed across the range, Sarah's team knew they had achieved something special. The electronic scoring system began calculating their results while spectators and competitors gathered around the control tower. Television cameras captured every moment as officials verified the scores and confirmed what everyone suspected. They had shattered the 17-year record. The final tally showed 494 out of 500 possible points, a score that exceeded the previous record by 7 points, an enormous margin in precision shooting where single points often determined winners. Sarah's individual contribution had been exceptional, with near-perfect accuracy across all ranges and conditions. As the results were announced, the crowd erupted in applause that could be heard across the entire facility. Photographers captured images of Sarah holding her grandfather's scope above her head in triumph, the vintage optic gleaming in the morning sunlight. The image would become iconic in military and shooting circles, representing the timeless values of skill, determination, and respect for tradition. General Morrison presented the team championship trophy to Sarah's squad while news crews documented the historic moment. When asked about her success with vintage equipment, Sarah spoke directly to the cameras about her grandfather's influence and the lessons he had taught her about marksmanship and life. "This scope represents more than just equipment," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion she felt. "It represents the wisdom of previous generations, the importance of fundamentals, and the truth that skill will always matter more than technology. My grandfather taught me that if you take care of your equipment and trust your training, you can accomplish anything." The individual awards ceremony revealed that Sarah had achieved the highest personal score in the competition's history. Her consistency across all shooting disciplines and her exceptional performance under pressure had set new standards for competitive marksmanship. The shooting community watched in amazement as the young Marine with the antique scope redefined what was possible in their sport. But for Sarah, the greatest moment came when her grandfather approached the award platform. Despite his illness and frailty, he had insisted on traveling across the country to witness her triumph. When she handed him the gold medal, his eyes filled with tears that spoke of pride, vindication, and the satisfaction of seeing his teachings validated on the highest stage. "Mija," he whispered in her ear as they embraced, "you made an old man very proud today. But more importantly, you proved that the old ways still have value in this modern world." The media attention that followed Sarah's record-breaking performance was intense but largely positive. Stories appeared in military publications, shooting magazines, and mainstream news outlets about the Marine who had used her grandfather's vintage scope to achieve shooting immortality. The narrative resonated with people who understood the value of tradition and the importance of honoring those who came before. Equipment manufacturers approached Sarah with endorsement offers, but she remained loyal to her grandfather's scope. Several museums requested the opportunity to display the historic optic, but Sarah politely declined. The scope belonged in her hands, where it could continue to honor the memory of the man who had taught her that sometimes the old ways were indeed the best ways. Sarah's success opened doors throughout the military and competitive shooting worlds. She received invitations to compete in international competitions, opportunities to attend advanced training courses, and offers to join elite marksmanship units. But she also understood that her greatest responsibility was to pass along the lessons she had learned to the next generation of shooters. When she returned to Camp Pendleton, Sarah found that her story had inspired Marines throughout the Corps. Young shooters sought her guidance, hoping to learn the fundamentals that had enabled her historic performance. She took time to work with each one individually, teaching them the same lessons her grandfather had shared with her about patience, persistence, and respect for the tools of their trade. The mockery that had once followed Sarah through the ranks had been replaced by admiration and respect. The Marines who had ridiculed her grandfather's scope now asked questions about her techniques and training methods. Corporal Stevens, who had been among her harshest critics, approached her with genuine humility to ask for shooting advice. Master Sergeant Rodriguez continued to maintain Sarah's scope, ensuring that it would perform reliably for years to come. He had become something of a celebrity himself, as other shooters brought vintage equipment to him for restoration and optimization. The success of Sarah's grandfather's scope had sparked renewed interest in classic optics and traditional shooting methods. Sergeant Williams was promoted to Master Sergeant and given command of the Marine Corps' Advanced Marksmanship Program. He credited Sarah's success with validating his training methods and his belief that fundamentals mattered more than equipment. Under his leadership, The program began incorporating more traditional techniques alongside modern technology. Sarah's grandfather lived long enough to see her compete in 2 more major competitions, where she continued to achieve exceptional results with his vintage scope. When he passed away peacefully the following spring, Sarah inherited not only his shooting equipment but also his ranch in Colorado, where she planned to continue the tradition of teaching young people the art of precision marksmanship. At his funeral, Sarah spoke about the lessons her grandfather had taught her that extended far beyond shooting. He had shown her that excellence came from dedication to fundamentals, that true skill transcended technological advantages, and that the wisdom of previous generations should never be dismissed or forgotten. The scope now rests in a place of honor in Sarah's home, still functional and still capable of the precision that made her famous. Occasionally, she takes it to the range to maintain her skills and remember the man who gave her both the tools and the wisdom to achieve greatness. When young shooters ask about her success, she tells them the same thing her grandfather told her, that if you take care of your equipment and never stop learning, you can accomplish anything. Sarah Martinez's story became legend in military and shooting circles, proof that skill, determination, and respect for tradition could overcome any obstacle.